So I'm just going to quickly talk you through what I want you to have a go at once you've finished reading through on that final section of Stave 2. So the overarching question that I want you to be thinking about is this one. How does Dickens use flashback in order to underline the way that the Ghost of Christmas Past teaches Scrooge morality? So how does Dickens use this narrative technique where we're pulled back into the past in order to show us the way that the ghost is basically teaching Scrooge a moral lesson? So we're trying to connect those two things. That narrative technique of jumping back into the past and the writer trying to teach the main character a moral lesson. Now what we're going to do is have a look at a process that I like to call word echoes. So we're going to take a look at a couple of sections from this passage of the story. And then what I want to show to you is how you do a word echo chain with a couple of examples. And then how you would use those word echoes to develop a short passage of analysis. Okay, so there's 4 examples of these that I want you to look at and have a go at. Gradually, as you go from A, B, C to D, a little bit more is expected of you in each one. So I want to talk you through this very first one so that you can see what processes you're trying to think about. So in this first quote, there was an eager, greedy, restless motion in the eye which showed the passion that had taken root and where the shadow of the growing tree would fall. It's a description of Scrooge as a young man in that scene where he is interacting with Belle. And it's describing the growth of his greed as a passion, something that he cares about deeply, but obviously it's something that's wrong to care about deeply. And it's described as if it was a tree. So it takes root, it puts roots into the ground, and then it grows and casts a shadow over him. So this first little section here, the passion that had taken root, uses this tree metaphor to show us the way that Scrooge's avarice has grown, his greed has got bigger and more significant. And then the phrase, the shadow of the growing tree, it shows us that the way that this sort of passion for money tree that Dickens is describing metaphorically is going to cast a shadow over Scrooge, over his face literally, but suggesting that it's going to dominate his character for the rest of his life and darken the rest of his life. So in those 2 quotes, there's 2 key words here, root and shadow. Now the way that these work, word echo chains, is just to think, root, what's the next thing that it reminds you of? Plant. What's the next thing that plant reminds you of? Growth. What's the next thing that growth reminds you of? Development. What's the next thing that development reminds you of? Change. Change reminds us of perhaps adapting to life. What you're not supposed to do is think, okay, root reminds me of plant and also of growth. You're only supposed to think of the very next thing. So you think root reminds you of something, and then you start again with that word. You don't think back to root. You think, okay, plant reminds me of what? Growth. And you want to kind of let your thoughts run a bit wild here. Don't try and control them and think about them too logically. We've done the same thing underneath with shadow. Shadow reminds me of darkness. Darkness reminds me of loss. Loss reminds me of sadness. Sadness reminds me of grief. And grief reminds me of pain. So what we're trying to think about there are all of the different possible echoes that some of these key words, the sorts of words that we might zoom in on in analysis, seem to remind us of, to try and draw out our points about these individual words and phrases. So what we've got underneath then is just a sentence of analysis for each one, a kind of zoom in on the word root, on the word shadow. And the challenge that you're going to be trying to do is to eventually produce one of these chains yourself and then use them as the basis for an explanation of a word or a phrase, a zoom in. So if you look at this example here, the way the passion for money in Scrooge takes root suggests that Scrooge's greed is like a plant that will grow, revealing how his development that should be. how his development will be a change that involves adapting to his increasingly greedy life. Just want to put that in blue to make it clear. So, what we've got in that explanation is a piece of analysis that touches on all of these echoes that word contains. And it naturally will guide you towards a slightly deeper explanation of what that word seems to imply. So if we have a look at the second example, the fact that this passion for money is revealed to have caused a shadow over Scrooge's life implies that his greed will only bring darkness in the form of emotional loss, sadness, and grief caused by the pain of his loneliness. Okay, so each one of those steps is giving you a point to try and include within a zoom in. Okay, so we've got one here, and this is where your work starts, and this is the one I'm going to explain to you, and then I want you to try and have a go at the rest of them. It matters little, she said softly. To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me. So this, in this quotation, this is where Belle is speaking to Scrooge. And the phrases we're looking at here, to you, very little. Here, she starts her sentence with an address to Scrooge that suggests that he doesn't really care about the problems in their relationship. And then we look at the word idol. An idol is an object of worship, which are often spiritual. And in what are called Abrahamic religions, Christianity and Judaism, for example, worshipping idols as if they were God, so things that are not God but that look like him, like statues, paintings, images, is a sin, which suggests the way Scrooge is behaving in an immoral way by becoming greedy. She here is talking about money. The idol is money, and that is what has displaced her in her eyes. So we've got here the example: idol, statue, beauty, worship, adoration, and sinfulness. And then the zoom in goes up to worship. So what's missing is adoration and sinfulness. So the analysis is here. The way Belle describes money as an idol compares it almost to a statue, often a source of beauty and worship, implying, and that's what you have to try and finish off, and you've got to try in the last part of that sentence touch on the idea of adoration or adoring, and then sin or sinfulness. You don't have to use the words in exactly the same form there. You could use adoring or adore, and you could use sin or sinning instead of sinfulness. But you've got to try and touch on those concepts. Then what I want you to try and do is have a go with these last three examples. My dog is trying to encourage you. So we've got our contract is an old one. It is made when we were both poor and content to be so. This is Belle again talking about their relationship and what is wrong with it now in relation to the past. All you've got in the analysis of that particular example is contract, not contrast. It should be contract as the first port of call. So your analysis is trying here to touch upon each of those concepts: agreement, money, legal, a lack of feeling, coldness. C, they've been included, but you've got to kind of flesh this sentence out. And then D, most difficult of all, you're looking at this last quote where Scrooge has seen Belle with her husband and he's deeply distressed. And you're focusing on the word broken and what it reminds you of first. So I want you to produce the echo chain and then try and use the words you produce in the echo chain to write a sentence of analysis on broken voice.